In the ancient world, where myth and history often blend into a single shadow, one empire once stood above all others. Assyria, the kingdom that Semiramis had expanded through brilliance, ambition, and relentless force, was now entering the darkest chapter of its existence. To understand its collapse, we must first understand the contrast between two rulers, Semiramis and Sardanapalus. Semiramis had been a builder, a conqueror, a visionary. She led armies, founded cities, and reshaped the Near East. But generations after her death, the throne belonged to a man completely opposite of everything she represented. Sardanapalus, described in ancient texts as the weakest and most decadent of all Assyrian kings, rarely appeared before his people. He ignored the affairs of state and lived hidden inside his palace, surrounded by women, eunuchs, music, and endless luxury. Historians portray him as the embodiment of political decay. The palace had become a place of pleasure, not power. Every day was a festival, every night a celebration of excess. According to ancient writings, Sardanapalus even dressed in women's clothing and spent his life in a haze of sensual entertainment. And carved upon a monument attributed to him was a message that revealed everything about his character. Eat, drink, enjoy yourself, for everything else is not your concern. This was the philosophy of the last king of Assyria, and this philosophy would become the spark that ignited the fall of an empire. But the true beginning of Assyria's downfall came when Arbaces, the satrap of Media, was granted entry into the royal palace. He entered as a guest, but what he witnessed would change the fate of nations. Arbaces saw a king consumed by pleasure, a court ruled by eunuchs and entertainers, an army without discipline, and a people who had lost respect for their monarchy. He saw a once mighty empire rotting from the inside. Shaken by what he had witnessed, Arbaces turned to Belesis, the powerful Babylonian priest, a man respected for wisdom and influence. When Arbaces described the state of the palace, Belesis was not surprised. He too had seen the signs of decline, moral decay, corruption, and a military machine that no longer obeyed its king. Belesis told Arbaces what he had feared to admit, that an empire loses the favor of the gods when its ruler loses the virtues of a king. And so, quietly, in secret, the two men began to plan the conspiracy that would shake the foundations of Assyria. They reached out to the Medes, to Babylonian leaders, to governors who were tired of Assyria's excesses, and to soldiers who longed for discipline and purpose. The rebellion grew slowly, quietly, like a shadow spreading beneath the palace walls. Meanwhile, Sardanapalus continued his feasts, his music, his pleasures. He did not feel the earth shifting beneath his throne. Only when the first revolts erupted in the provinces did the king realize that something was terribly wrong. But it was already too late. Assyria's enemies had united. Its people had risen. Its army was broken. For the first time in centuries, the great empire faced a war within its own borders. Sardanapalus attempted to rally his forces, but no king can awaken an army he himself allowed to die. The discipline was gone. The spirit was gone. The loyalty was gone. And the gods, according to ancient belief, had turned away from him. The first battles were victories for Arbaces. Strategy was on his side, while panic was on the king's. The stage was set for the final confrontation, in the heart of the empire, in a city believed to be indestructible, Nineveh, the city of massive walls, the city protected by prophecy, the city that would fall only if the river Tigris itself destroyed its defenses. Most people laughed at such a prophecy. Nineveh seemed eternal, but history was about to prove otherwise. The revolt spread quickly, far faster than Sardanapalus had expected. Arbaces and Belesis, once simply subjects of the empire, had now become leaders of a coalition strong enough to challenge the Assyrian throne. Province after province began to rise. Soldiers deserted. Governors switched sides. Ancient loyalties dissolved like sand in a storm. The empire that had once ruled nations was now struggling to defend itself from within. Arbaces was a strategist. He moved swiftly, cutting supply lines, capturing fortresses, and gaining the support of peoples who had long suffered under Assyrian rule. Belesis, on the other hand, strengthened the rebellion with the power of religion. He declared that the gods themselves had abandoned Sardanapalus, and that resistance to him was a sacred duty. Together, these two forces, military and spiritual, formed a rebellion unlike anything Assyria had seen. Sardanapalus finally realized the magnitude of the threat. He attempted to gather what forces he still had, but the spirit of his army was shattered. Many soldiers openly questioned his authority. Others refused to fight at all. How could they defend a king who had never defended them? And so, the final battleground became inevitable. Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, a city surrounded by massive walls, moats, and layers of fortifications that had stood for centuries. Ancient texts say that Nineveh could not fall unless the river Tigris itself turned against it, a prophecy so unlikely that even the rebels did not dare hope for such a thing. But Arbaces knew that a long siege would eventually break the city, and so he surrounded Nineveh with his armies, cutting off supplies, communications, and reinforcements. Inside the city, fear grew. The people remembered the old prophecy. They whispered that the gods were angry. Sardanapalus tried to reassure them, but no feast, no celebration, no display of royal wealth could silence the dread that filled the streets. And then, after months of siege, something extraordinary happened. Heavy rains poured for days without stopping. The river Tigris swelled, grew violent, and began to lash against the walls of Nineveh. The unthinkable was happening. The prophecy was awakening. The waters rose higher, flooding the lower parts of the city. Then, with a force no army could match, a section of the massive wall collapsed. A breach had opened. Nineveh, thought to be eternal, was suddenly vulnerable. Panic erupted. Citizens fled in every direction. Soldiers tried desperately to hold back the attackers, but the flood had already broken their spirit. Arbaces seized the moment. The Medes and Babylonians surged through the breach, entering the heart of the city. The final battle had begun. Fires spread through the streets. Temples burned. The great halls of Nineveh filled with smoke and screams. The empire of Semiramis, the empire of mighty kings, was collapsing in a single night of chaos. Sardanapalus understood that the end had come. He knew he could not escape, and he refused to be taken as a captive or a slave. So, according to ancient sources, he gathered all his treasures, all his gold, his jewels, and the women of his palace, and ordered a massive pyre to be built within the royal residence. As flames rose around him, the last king of the first Assyrian Empire chose death over surrender, and in that fire ended the dynasty that had ruled the Near East for more than 1,000 years. The flames that consumed Sardanapalus did more than end the life of a king. They marked the end of the first great Assyrian Empire. For centuries, Assyria had dominated the Near East with unmatched power, but in a single night of fire and flood, its legacy was reduced to ashes. With Nineveh destroyed, the victorious leaders, Arbaces of Media and Belesis of Babylon, began to reshape the world that Assyria left behind. Arbaces claimed the throne of Media, founding a new dynasty that would rise to extraordinary power. Belesis, the Babylonian priest, restored influence to the temples and cities that had once been overshadowed by Assyria's military might. Together, their victory did not just end an empire, it created new ones. From the ruins of Assyria emerged two rising forces, Media in the north and Babylon in the south. These two kingdoms would eventually unite in a new balance of power across the Near East. But Assyria was not gone forever. A second Assyrian kingdom would rise, smaller, weaker, a shadow of its former greatness. This second Assyrian Empire, spoken of in ancient texts, would last for more than 2 centuries. Yet even this reborn Assyria could not withstand the next shift in history, for a new power was awakening in the East. A power greater than Media, greater than Babylon, a power that would change the world forever. Persia, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. The Persians swept across the region, challenging every kingdom that stood in their way. Cyrus defeated Media, absorbed Babylon, and completed what destiny had already begun, the final erasure of Assyrian power. And in one of history's most significant moments, Cyrus issued a decree, allowing the Jewish people, who had lived in Babylonian captivity for 70 years, to return to their homeland. This marked the end of what ancient writers call the 70 years of exile. Thus, the fall of Assyria did not simply end a kingdom. It transformed the destiny of nations, faiths, and civilizations. From Semiramis to Sardanapalus, from rise to glory to destruction, the story of Assyria is a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of its own actions. A kingdom built on discipline and courage felt a decadence and neglect. A city once thought eternal collapsed under the weight of prophecy and flood, and a dynasty that had ruled for 1,000 years was erased in a single night of fire. But in its ashes, new empires rose, new rulers emerged, and history, as it always does, moved forward, leaving behind only the echoes of an empire that once believed itself invincible.